which most people don't report when they're looking at their copies of.
Well, let me just interject. You're talking about someone we refer to as Black Tie Man, who creates a physical anomaly because he's both in front of and behind the person known as Doorman. So you're actually onto one of the really important arguments for the alteration of the film, to wit that, in essence, because of the Doorman's presence, the left shoulder of Doorman is actually missing. So that unless he doesn't have a clavicle, unless he doesn't have a shoulder bone, something is very strange going on there. Plus, Black Tie Man is not the only figure in the background. We have somebody holding their hands up who appears to be wearing a short-sleeved shirt, and whom we have conjectured was actually Billy Lovelady, because he went to the FBI a few months after the assassination, apparently troubled because he'd been identified as Doorman, and explained to them and brought with him the shirt he said he'd been wearing. It was a red and white vertically striped short-sleeve shirt, completely inconsistent with the image we're referring to as Doorman, but consistent with the figure who's holding his hands up, who is further to the right as we look at the photograph. So, I mean, I just want to add that to mention. I mean, we've gone through this in such excruciating detail, Chuck, that there's a huge amount going on here, but please do continue.
Well, I'm just going to give you my perspective on it from what I was able to observe, and perhaps I'm incorrect. I always allow for that because, listen, this has been a continuous process. Just because I've studied, I've had that picture in my possession for 20 years, it doesn't mean that I know every single thing that's in the photograph, even. Because
and when you talk about when you talk about having the photograph as close as you can be, tell me exactly what you have and where you obtained it.
My copy comes from, I think, the Tribune. Comes from an archive of a Tribune newspaper.
Which Tribune?
I'm looking.
Chicago Tribune. Chicago Tribune.
No, one of the. I believe it's like in Iowa or something like this, where it originated.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. It's you know what? You are correct. Actually, it is from the Chicago Tribune archive.
Okay.
It does come from the Chicago Tribune. I'm mixing it up with another. Sorry.
And what do you see in it that bothers you in relation to our analysis?
Well, when I take that area, which, by the way, is a very small area, physically. What would you say that area is on the original print? About
5%.
Yeah, less. about that, right?
Maybe less.
Maybe less. That's
but
true.
It's the only area of the photograph, by the way, that shows these significant anomalies. Robin Unger, who's very good at this, made that observation during a quite extended thread that occurred on the Education Forum.
Mm-hmm. But when I take it and blow it up to about a 30 inches by 30 inches, I can blow it up to clearly. Okay. When I do that, I cannot even begin to argue that that's not Lovelady standing there, and that shirt pattern is evident in this photograph, in my version of the photograph for certain.
What shirt pattern is evident?
The shirt pattern that everybody points to, that flannel shirt pattern.
You're talking about the checkered shirt?
Yeah, the checkered-looking shirt, which I think is...
Well, listen, I don't want to... But I have we'll come back to that, Chuck. Let me ask you this. Do you see the figure to the right front facing the photograph whose face has been obfuscated?
That appears to be... Are we talking about the guy with his hands up?
No, below him.
Oh, okay, so over to the left there.
Well, maybe slightly in between Doorman and the man with his hands raised and down. The point is, like a step down, you got a man whose face has been obfuscated. Go to JFK, what we know now that we didn't know then, because there I have circled the image I'm talking about. So I'm asking you, do you not see that this man's face has been obfuscated in the photograph you're looking at from the Chicago Tribune?
Well, I'm going to go to that picture right now.
Yeah, please. Yeah, good.
I'll look at your version of it exactly. So.
Well, this is only that tiny part of it, but yeah, that's what's crucial here.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Anyway, as I'm going through this, though, I just want to say that what I looked at with the doorway figure, and I'm going to that picture right now. Why is it sending me there?
Things are always slow when we want them to be fast.
Yeah, of course. Normally I'd be right on it, but okay. Okay.
You see what I'm talking about with the circle?
Yeah, you're talking about the distortions there.
I'm not talking about distortions. I'm talking about the circled image of a man whose face has been obfuscated.
Yeah, well, I'm saying his face is distorted there.
It's not distorted. A distortion is the sort of thing that can occur by stretching. Take a piece of rubber and stretch it. Look in a funny mirror. Those are distortions. This face has been obfuscated. It's been removed. It's been scratched out.
That clearly looks like that's been scratched out to you?
Oh, absolutely. You have any doubt about it? Now, I'm asking you, look at the photograph you have from the Chicago Tribune. Does it or does it not have that same face obfuscated?
I'm trying to compare them. It's a softer. Okay, see, on yours, it's a very hard looking. I can see how you're saying that looks like it's removed. Yeah. Yeah, for certain, I can see that's why you're saying that.
Yeah, well, I'm convinced it's true.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with you that it's not. I'm simply saying that I'm looking at it myself and saying, well, that does look strange. Yes.
But Chuck, listen, that shirt is obviously completely different than the shirt Billy Lovelady wore when he visited the FBI. He was photographed wearing it. Completely different. Now, it may be consistent, I believe it is, with the man holding his hands over his eyes in the background, who appears to be wearing a short-sleeve shirt that appears to be striped. But when we talk about Doorman, he's wearing a very distinctive shirt. It's a very unusual shirt, and it has many features that appear to be the same as the shirt that Lee Oswald was wearing when he was arrested.
Well, that's mainly from the neckline. You're probably thinking that, and that neckline is definitely apparent in the version I have. But when I examine the sleeves, he's wearing a sleeved shirt in the Tribune version, and the sleeves appear to be entirely consistent with that black and red shirt. That's the odd thing. Now, the figure behind there, I have not really studied in depth, but he may be wearing. It would be very funny to me if they were both wearing the same shirt.
Yes, they are both wearing the same shirt. Now, Ralph made there are a whole lot of features, including the lapel, the way it hangs. There were tears at the bottom that have been obfuscated by the face of this black man that's extremely anomalous, sticking out there from the side. I mean, there's so many funny features here.
Well, that's why I can't see the hole. The hole in the sleeve was something somebody tried to explain to me because Oswald's shirt had a hole in the sleeve. And it should be evident there, but it's being blocked out by the guy who's like 2 steps down. Is that what you're talking about there?
Well, there's actually the face of a black man. Do you see that protruding almost in a abdomen high for coming out of the wall, as it were? You have the side view, the profile of a black man's face. Do you see that?
Yeah.
It's very peculiar. Listen, Chuck, we don't want to.
There's a lot of peculiar aspects to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I encourage anyone to take a look at those 5 studies that we have. I published on Veterans Today. Oswald was in the doorway after all. Take a look. Well, there's a lot going on there. We may return to this on another occasion, Chuck. For now, I want us to take our final break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest today, Charles Ochelli. We're talking about JFK. This is Jim Fetzer concluding my conversation with Charles Ochelli. We've been talking about the JFK and a host of other issues. Chuck, would you like to add any more about the Alchin's photograph and the question about who was in the doorway?
Well, I say this to anybody listening, and that is that either way, you should not take what either Jim or myself say as gospel on this. I really encourage anybody to get a hold of the photograph themselves, get a hold of the best, earliest copy you can, and take a look at all of these anomalies that we've mentioned ourselves and see, what it is that's actually there and what it is that's being depicted for yourself. Because the fact is, if you look at these things and you find even, a tenth of the kinds of things that we're talking about here, you'll have a revelation for yourself about exactly what effort was made to absolutely obfuscate the truth regarding the assassination.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. Yeah, and as I say, go look at the evidence yourself. I mean, the fact that I'm convinced doesn't mean that you're convinced. It's just, it's a matter of different people's background and experience, knowledge, reasoning ability, etc.
Exactly.
Tell me more, Chuck. I know you've become very interested in the book about Oswald in Russia by Tivitz. I actually had him set up for an interview, and for whatever reason it didn't happen. And I was looking forward to it, though I had not at that point read the book. In fact, I started looking at it, and I sure found it fascinating. And he seems to have an exceptional command of English.
Yes, his English is pretty good, and that was one of the reasons why he had befriended Oswald while he was there. Because after all, Dr. Tivitz was a friend of Oswald's when Dr. Tivitz was a medical student, and Oswald had gone to Russia and spent his 3 years there, which is one of the most fascinating chapters behind our favorite Patsy. The fact that he was able to go to Russia and be there for 3 years, and we could spend, believe me, many a show just discussing that. The fact that he was obviously an asset of the intelligence community in one way or another.
And that was obvious to his Russian friends from scratch.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, way more than obvious to them. Some of them were either utilized by or members, those that weren't members of the KGB were being utilized by the KGB to observe every single thing that he was doing when he was over there. They had the apartment well bugged and everything else. But what I find interesting about Tivitz and his book, primarily what got me interested, was this little bit of audio that he's released from some tapes he made with Oswald, which we haven't gotten too many opportunities to hear Lee speak over the years, outside of those, ridiculously contrived interviews that he did
in New Orleans.
In New Orleans with WDSU, and Ed Butler and those guys were all involved in that. But when you take a listen to Lee and now Dr. Tivitz sitting there basically screwing around with a tape recorder together, like young guys are apt to do, especially, now I'm going to date myself a bit here, but the fact is that when we used to get a hold of a tape recorder when we were kids, a lot of us would play games with it and act like we were doing radio shows or whatever else. And this is precisely the kind of stuff that he and Lee were doing. And I think it provides a little bit more of the, truly human aspects of this individual. A lot of people forget that he was a person, and that he was far more complex than, I'm disturbed, I hate America, let me shoot the president.
Yes.
And meanwhile, I'm not sure exactly why I'm disturbed, because I may be with the workers of the Communist Revolution, or I may be with the elite of the Communist Revolution, depending on which newspaper I happen to drop out of my hand here in these backyard photographs. But
tell us more about the Tivitz observations and book and all that.
Well, I think it's a very interesting episode, and I think that one has to very carefully go through a lot of the stuff that's been publicly released about his time in Russia, because some of it is, again, pieces of disinformation designed to paint a certain picture about the man. I think it's very obvious that he was part of the false defector program, which we found out about in very minor detail later on. And I think he was sent there to do particular jobs, and I think at the end of the day, he really didn't get very much of it done. He wound up working in a radio factory, and people talk about his reaction or interaction about the U-2 incidents. And, I found it interesting about how Tivitz explains, Lee finding out about it while he was at work in the radio factory, being treated better than the other workers and stuff like that. And it's definitely, I wouldn't say that it's the entire story. And I always say, always question these things when somebody has a revealing book that comes out or a revealing documentary or whatever else. You have to look at all aspects of it. Some of the individuals that released information from Russia may have been disingenuous at certain times, trying to sell us things that comported with whatever sort of image they wanted to draw of Oswald personally. And the fact is, though, that I really have taken the Titovitz account as honest as possible, coming from his perspective. But again, you have to be skeptical of these things because there was a situation where you had, lots of individuals that were either involved in or directly employed by the intelligence agencies there. And in some cases, I'm not saying that Titovitz is an absolutely 100% truthful guy, but just in the limited dealings I've had with him and by reading his book and things like this, I think that it's fairly honest. And where he didn't have the information, he actually did some pretty deep research, even went into the archives over there in Belarus and got some information about Oswald's KGB file, which, despite the fact that Bill Clinton had some documents turned over to him by Russian officials some years back, we have never been given the complete story from the KGB. But would that be any sort of surprise? Our own government won't give us the complete story.
Yeah, well, there's apparently a great deal to cover up.
Absolutely, and that is the key here, is that, again, when you witness how much is being covered up and the various mechanisms, whether it be, altering the evidence, losing the evidence, distorting the meaning of evidence, changing or fabricating testimony, this entire case is completely littered with it. And as you said, you spent a significant amount of time sorting the inauthentic from the authentic.
Well, Chuck, tell me to begin with, how did Titovitz come into contact with Lee?
Well, as I said, Lee had gone over there, and Titovitz was in Belarus at the time, which is where they wound up putting Lee after the whole incident with the hospital and the. I say apparent because I'm starting to question exactly what went on, but he wound up in the hospital after this purported suicide attempt where it's slashed one of his wrists and sort of.
Oh, that was clearly fake. Yes, that was.
It was either a hysterical gesture, a legitimate hysterical gesture in order to manipulate the situation, or it was a fabricated incident.
Oh, I think it was fabricated. I don't have any doubt about it.
Well, it depends on what level we start calling things fabricated and what level we, Well,
we know he had a history in intelligence. He was recruited by ONI when he was in the Marine Corps. He was stationed at the most highly classified base in the American military at Atsugi. His defection was a fraudulent one. He renounced his citizenship, as I recall, on a Sunday when it had no legal significance whatsoever because the embassy wasn't even open.
And it was never legitimately followed through on. The person working at the embassy there just took his passport and threw it in a desk drawer. Never actually went through the paperwork or did anything else with him.
Probably purposefully, because they knew this was a fake defection.
Oh, absolutely. I agree
public
with that.
consumption.
Well, there was a handful of guys that have provably been found to have been fake defectors.
Yes. Who seem to have been available for use as patsies in the assassination of JFK at various locations.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. Not only that, but a few of them happen to have been introduced to Marina Oswald, too, while she was there. But that's a whole other story, isn't it?
Well, I'm interested in that, too. But tell me, what did you take of Titovitz's assessment of Lee's intellectual abilities, his fluency with Russian, his general knowledge? Tell me things like that.
Well, you have to take these things in like the aggregate. You can't just simply examine his point of view because the difference on people that I do believe are trying to tell us the truth about how they assess Oswald's capabilities, et cetera, his Russian, for instance, this is a very good point. His Russian, which has been reported to have been, really good or really bad, depending on who you're talking to. And believe me, I'm not going into the Mexico City thing where his Russian was terrible and his Spanish was good, and there's no indication that he knew how to speak Spanish all that well.
Personally, I don't believe he was ever in Mexico City.
Oh, well, you and I absolutely agree there, too. I absolutely believe that he wasn't there at all.
Yes.
You
A
know,
photograph of the guy who doesn't look anything like him. He looks a great deal like Jim Hicks, who claimed to be communication coordinator, who was photographed in Dealey Plaza. And, of course, the voice wasn't Lee Oswald's voice, and J. Edgar Hoover himself actually put out a memorandum that somebody was impersonating Lee Oswald in Mexico City.
precisely. And the individual that's in that photograph actually has been identified to me various times as a KGB operative whose first name was Yuri, but apparently had a few different last names. So that's who that guy was. I'm very convinced that's who that was. But here's the curious point about that and why it is that we absolutely state that there's no way he was there. The CIA had, at the very least, okay, because you're talking about the Russian and the Cuban embassies, and the consulates were also together on compounds with them. An embassy and a consulate are two different things, but they were both together in these compounds. Now, located outside of each compound was at least based on the Lopez report, one automatic camera and then one asset where a human operator was there for a camera to photograph anyone coming in or out of those embassies. That means that 24 hours a day, there was coverage on anyone going in or out of those embassies. Now, based on all the phone calls and the official story here, there has to have been at least 10 opportunities for the Central Intelligence Agency to have acquired photographs, and that's 10 different incidents. That doesn't mean, if you just assume there's only one photograph of each occurrence of him going in or out, and they were specifically paying attention to any white guys going in or out of these embassies there in Mexico, okay? But the fact is that if you have at least 10 incidents and 10 opportunities to take photographs, to this day, the CIA has never released a photograph that could even remotely beat Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City.
Yeah, and that means the probability that Lee was there is zero, because each of those, the probability of taking his picture had it been there should have been 1 on each of those 10 occasions.
Minimally.
Yeah.
Minimally.
Well,
because as you know, they could have easily fired 6-10 pictures, with a shutter.
But the point I'm making, the probability can't be higher than 1. I mean, so, 1 times 1 10 times equals 1, but the alternative to, taking the picture is, if he's there, is 1. The probability of not taking the picture if he's not there is 0. So, I mean, it's 0. They don't have the picture, he wasn't there.
That's precisely it, because if they wanted that photograph. They would have loved to have had that photograph, even to just circulate to people like Earl Warren to back up the story where they were giving him this transcript and all this other nonsense about, listen, we may have a nuclear war on our hands if you don't do the right thing here with the Warren Commission and the others that were drawn into these things like that. Even if just for use there, they would have used it as an illustrative tool. And the fact is that after all of the investigation and everything else, not a single photograph of Oswald there has turned up. There are 13 photographs that I have of this guy that, the other Oswald photo, the guy that I tell you is named Yuri.
Yeah.
I have 13 different photographs of him.
Well, I noticed in Robert Grodin's The Search for Lee Harvey Oswald, there are at least a half a dozen.
Mm-hmm. He has about 6, but part of a release during the HSCA.
And, of course, none of them look remotely like Lee. I mean, he's too big, he's too heavy, his face is completely different, his haircut. I mean, it's not Lee Oswald at all. I mean, it's ridiculous. Not even
close. It's not even close. Somebody could have mistaken him for it or anything else. And since there are documents in our government's hands that seem to indicate that he was there, and yet they don't have the photographs, we have, again, the fabrication of evidence.
Yeah.
And but, again, these are things that you can look into all by yourself all the time, and I'm telling you, you can spend years and continuously.
Well, tell us more about Titovet's assessment of Lee, his intellect, his character, what he was doing there. Was he ever out hunting with Lee? I mean, we have all these reports of how he couldn't even hit anything with a shotgun.
Well, that was with the factory workers, the guys he worked with at the television factory there, ostensibly the television and radio factory. And that wasn't Titovitz wasn't involved with that. He, of course, heard about it and heard about it through these other friends and such. But Titovitz was mainly interested in interacting with Lee because of his interest in English and because obviously that would be Lee's native language. And some of those recordings were interesting because they were reading from books and like I told you, reenacting like radio shows and stuff like this. Some people have taken some of those things out of context and attempted to use them, and this bothered Titovitz a lot, which has caused him to not release. He has hours of tape on Lee that he has not released, and it's because
you mean hours of Lee on tape?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That he hasn't made known to people. There's only a couple of minutes of it floating around right now that he let out as part of a way to sort of say, listen, here's me interacting with Lee, and I was his friend. And I think that legitimately Titovitz liked him. He found him to be someone who assessed his own intellect as higher than it was. He was a fairly smart guy, but he thought he was more intelligent than he was.
Sure.
His Russian was not good, but even he had difficulty with his own native language, that Titovitz reported. And there's a reason for that, and that is that it's been noted earlier on, and of course it is part of some of the disinformation, but the fact is, I think this is true, that Lee did have a bit of a learning disability and had a little bit of trouble reading and sometimes articulating things.
Well, he may have been dyslexic.
I believe that. I wouldn't, specifically lay that on him, but it does indicate that he may have been, that may be exactly correct. But, to say that he was dyslexic for sure, I wouldn't, because, like I said...
What about his intellectual capacity? Did they ever discuss philosophical ideas?
They discussed a great many different types of philosophical ideas, and it seemed as though, Titovitz felt that he was sort of reaching for areas that he wasn't quite comprehending, it seems to me. It's hard to characterize it all in one shot.
Meaning, his assessment was Lee didn't really comprehend what they were talking about in some cases.
Well, on a very rudimentary level, he may have, but he didn't really grasp all of the nuances.
He may have understood the words, but not the concepts.
Precisely. Like when people say that, Lee had made the statement about, no, I'm not a communist, but I am a Marxist. He may have made that statement and understood that there was a significance to that statement, but to really understand the nuances of that, I don't think he did. And the reason why I say that is because he would point to different countries as examples instead of being quite specific about the mechanical nature of the system of beliefs as opposed to, you know what I mean?
Well, the term communism is often used as a synonym for totalitarian. So, Marxism isn't totalitarian, at least. I mean, there is the period of transition, according to the Marxist theory of history, in which you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that's supposed to, wither away as resources become more equitably distributed and you have a more egalitarian society. In the case of the history of the Soviet Union, Lenin was a very clever political operative and was able to bring about a coup in a circumstance under which, from the Marxist point of view, it wasn't even possible that there should be a revolution then. I mean, it was...
Well, right, but the eventual goal of, reaching from that, like you said, reaching from the proletariat system to the eventual goal where you have the more equitable distribution of all resources and all things is more of a socialist ideal as opposed to, what people take as communism. Like you said, they often relate it to a totalitarianism, sort of like the misunderstanding about fascism or corporatism. It's not, these particular political ideals as opposed to, the more hardened structure of the corporatist system, where the state. I'm having trouble saying this.
You're doing fine, Chuck. Listen, there have been many speculations, that the Oswald who went to Russia wasn't the same guy who came back. Did Titovitz offer any suggestions or light on that question?
No, he didn't seem to. He didn't seem to offer about that. I mean, it's...
he he didn't think that the Oswald who was arrested and shot and all that was different than the Oswald he'd known in Russia.
No, it seemed to be the same guy, and he said that, essentially that's what fascinated him, is that, it made no sense to him that the man he knew, as he knew him, and with the way that he was as an individual, just as a person, he could not imagine how this guy ended up being the guy who's accused of the assassination of the President of the United States.
Yeah, he didn't have any violent tendencies, or wasn't an aggressive personality, or driven or conflicted emotionally.
Well, right. And in other words, the man that he knew was completely incongruous with the image that was being portrayed by the media, by the reports, and even later on, by the many investigations. He felt as though the man that he knew was not being represented at all, that this was, something far different.
Well, the American intel agencies, the FBI, CIA, have a genius for PR, for spinning cases, for demonization of someone they want to turn into an enemy. They did it with Saddam Hussein. They did it with Osama bin Laden. They did it with Muammar Gaddafi. They're doing it with Iran. I mean, it's endless how the political machine in the United States can turn somebody who may be perfectly innocuous or reasonable into some dark, threatening menace.
And so often it's the inversion of their original role. Saddam Hussein is somebody that we supported when he was, doing battle with Iran.
Yes.
Yes. A whole lot of these other guys that we're talking about, we make a deal with Gaddafi, and then not too long after that, we're overthrowing him. You're our friend, but, the second that the United States government, as it stands, calls you their friend, beware, because very soon thereafter, you're going to be the enemy.
Chuck, I'm so glad to have had you on today. I'm going to have you back. I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts, your research, your analysis. I very much enjoyed having you on.
All right. Well, I enjoyed this as well. I hope that we've accomplished something today.
Oh, I think it's been quite valuable. This is Jim Fetzer thanking my special guest, Charles Ochelli, for being here.